Eastern Front, Soviet Union. Winter 1943. The sound that haunted Pavel Sokolov's dreams wasn't the scream of diving Messerschmitts or the thunder of anti-aircraft fire. It was silence. The terrible, suffocating silence that filled his cockpit at 6,000 meters when his Yak-1's engine choked, sputtered, and died, leaving him suspended in the frozen sky like a wingless bird. In that moment, as German fighters circled below like sharks sensing blood, Pavel had learned what it meant to be powerless. He had watched 3 of his squadron mates fall that day, trailing black smoke into the snow-covered forests of Kursk, and he had survived only because gravity had been kinder to him than to his enemies. But survival, Pavel discovered, was not the same as living. Now, 3 months later, he stood in the cavernous assembly hall of Factory No. 292 in Saratov, watching mechanics swarm over dozens of Yakovlev fighters like ants rebuilding their colony after a storm. The air reeked of machine oil, aviation fuel, and welding torch ozone, a metallic perfume that clung to his uniform and invaded his lungs with every breath. Overhead lights swayed gently from the rafters, casting dancing shadows across the concrete floor, while the rhythmic hammering of rivets created a percussion that echoed off the high ceiling like distant artillery. He shouldn't have been here. Pilots belonged in the sky or in the briefing rooms, not in the guts of aircraft factories. But Pavel had insisted, had begged his commanding officer for permission to understand why his fighter had betrayed him when he needed it most. Why, at the critical moment of combat, the machine simply stopped climbing. "You're looking at the wrong thing, Captain." The voice came from behind him, rough as sandpaper, tinged with the accent of the Ural Mountains. Pavel turned to find a man who looked more like a coal miner than an aeronautical engineer. Dmitry Petrov was short and stocky, with shoulders that strained against his grease-stained coveralls and hands that bore the scars of 1,000 burns and cuts. His face was angular and weathered, framed by unkempt black hair streaked with premature gray, and his eyes held the peculiar intensity of someone who saw the world in equations and stress tolerances rather than colors and emotions. "What do you mean?" Pavel asked, his voice still carrying the hoarseness that came from screaming orders over engine noise and radio static. Dmitry approached one of the Yak-9s in mid-assembly, running his calloused hand along the cowling with the tenderness of a father touching his child's face. "You think the problem is power. Every pilot does. You want more horsepower, bigger engines, faster propellers." He shook his head slowly. "But the Germans don't beat us because their engines are stronger. They beat us because their planes climb faster at altitude. And do you know why?" Pavel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced watching his altimeter freeze while Bf-109s positioned themselves above him, claiming the vertical battlefield that meant the difference between hunter and hunted. Their fuel injection systems don't cut out in negative G maneuvers. "That's part of it," Dmitry conceded, producing a bent cigarette from his pocket and lighting it with a battered lighter. The smoke curled upward, briefly illuminating the dust particles dancing in a shaft of winter sunlight that pierced through a grimy window. "But there's something else, something simpler and more complicated at the same time." He gestured toward the gearbox assembly of the nearest fighter. "Come here. I want to show you something that's going to sound insane." As Pavel moved closer, Dmitry pulled a wrench from his belt and tapped it against the reduction gear housing, the critical component that connected the engine's screaming rotation to the propeller's controlled thrust. "This piece of equipment is manufactured to exact specifications. German precision, Soviet precision, American precision. We all aim for perfection. Tolerance of 1,000th of an inch. Everything balanced, everything smooth, everything efficient." He took a long drag on his cigarette, and Pavel noticed that the engineer's hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from exhaustion. How many hours had this man spent in this factory, Pavel wondered, while pilots like him received the glory and the medals? "But perfection," Dmitry continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "is the enemy of innovation. 3 weeks ago, I made a mistake. I was working the night shift, and I was so tired I could barely see straight. We were rushing to meet production quotas. Stalin doesn't accept excuses, and neither does the motherland when German tanks are rolling toward Moscow." He paused, and something like a smile ghosted across his weathered features. "I installed a reduction gear that was damaged. A tiny imperfection in one of the teeth. Stress fracture from improper heat treatment. By all rights, I should have scrapped it, melted it down, started over. But you didn't, Pavel said quietly, beginning to understand. I didn't. And the next day, the test pilot, Yegorov, you know him? He takes this fighter up for trials. Standard protocol, check handling at various altitudes, push the envelope, see what breaks before we send it to the front. Dmitri's eyes gleamed with something between madness and genius. Except nothing broke. Instead, Yegorov radios down that he's climbing faster than any Yak-9 he's ever flown. At 5,000 meters, he's matching our best performance. At 7,000 meters, he's exceeding it. At 8,500 meters, he's climbing at rates we didn't think were possible without a more powerful engine. Pavel felt his pulse quicken. That's impossible. A damaged gear should reduce efficiency, not increase it. Should. Yes. Dmitri crushed his cigarette under his boot heel. That's what I thought too. That's what every textbook and every engineering manual told me. So I brought the plane back down, tore apart the gearbox, and examined every millimeter of that broken gear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal component, a gear tooth with a barely visible crack running through its surface. This imperfection creates a harmonic vibration at specific RPMs. Instead of smoothly transferring power, it creates micro-pulses, thousands per minute. The effect is like a hammer striking an anvil instead of a hand pushing it. At certain altitudes where air density is lower, this pulsing actually increases propeller efficiency by preventing blade stall. The implications crashed over Pavel like a wave. You're telling me that by breaking the gear on purpose, we can make our fighters climb faster at high altitude? Not breaking, Dmitri corrected, holding up a finger. Calibrating the imperfection. Too much damage, and the gear fails catastrophically. Too little, and there's no effect. But get it exactly right. He trailed off, his gaze distant, seeing something beyond the factory walls. Perhaps the same sky where Pavel's squadron mates had died. We can give our pilots the vertical advantage. We can make the Yak-9 outclimb the Bf-109G at combat altitudes. We can turn the tables. Pavel thought of Lieutenant Volkov, shot down because he couldn't climb fast enough to escape a diving attack. He thought of Sergeant Kozlov, whose engine had stalled at 7,000 meters, leaving him defenseless. He thought of all the empty chairs in the squadron mess hall, all the unopened letters from mothers and wives and children who would never again see their heroes come home. How long? He asked. How long until we can implement this? Dmitri's expression darkened. That's the problem, Captain. I reported my findings to the factory director 3 weeks ago. He sent my report to the Aviation Design Bureau. They sent it to a committee. The committee sent it to another committee. Everyone wants to study it, analyze it, verify it through proper channels. His voice hardened with frustration. Meanwhile, we're losing pilots every day because they can't climb fast enough to engage on equal terms. Bureaucracy is killing more of our men than German bullets. The factory fell silent around them as the shift whistle blew, and workers began filing toward the exits, their footsteps echoing like a funeral march. Pavel watched them go, ordinary men and women who built extraordinary machines, whose names would never appear in history books or victory announcements, but whose labor kept the Red Air Force aloft. What if we bypass the committees? Pavel heard himself saying, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. What if we modify my squadron's fighters without official approval? Dmitri's eyes widened. That's a court-martial offense, for both of us. If the modifications fail in combat, if we lose planes because of unauthorized changes. We're already losing planes, Pavel interrupted, and he was surprised by the steel in his own voice. I lost 3 men in January, 2 more in February. Last week we couldn't intercept a German reconnaissance flight because we simply couldn't climb fast enough to reach their altitude before they completed their mission and escaped. He moved closer to the engineer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched in every line of Dmitri's face. How many more pilots have to die while committees debate and bureaucrats protect their positions? For a long moment, Dmitri said nothing. Somewhere in the factory a piece of metal fell, the clang reverberating through the empty space like a gong announcing a decision point. Outside, the February wind howled against the walls, carrying with it the promise of another brutal Eastern Front winter giving way, slowly, reluctantly, to spring. The spring offensive. More fighting, more dying. "I can modify 6 fighters in 2 nights, Dmitri finally said. "Working with a trusted crew. No paperwork, no official records. If it works, we'll have proof. If it fails—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Pavel understood. If it failed, they would both face firing squads or Siberian labor camps, if the Germans didn't kill them first. Pavel extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement." Dmitri's grip was firm, his palm rough against Pavel's own calluses. Different trades leaving different marks, but both shaped by war's demands. "There's one more thing you should know, Captain. This modification will make your aircraft less stable at low speeds and during takeoff. The vibration that helps at altitude becomes a liability near the ground. Your pilots will need to be good, very good, to handle it." "They're already good," Pavel said. "They're just flying with one hand tied behind their backs. You're going to untie that hand." Factory number 292, Saratov, night shift, February 1943. Darkness was their ally and their enemy. Dmitri Petrov stood beneath the skeletal fuselage of a Yak-9, his hands black with grease, his eyes burning from 40 consecutive hours without sleep. Around him, 4 trusted mechanics moved like ghosts through the factory's shadows, working by the dim glow of shielded work lamps that cast more darkness than light. Every sound seemed amplified in the cavernous space: the click of a wrench, the whisper of metal against metal, the distant howl of wind against the factory walls. "How much longer?" Pavel's voice came from behind, startling Dmitri despite expecting it. The engineer didn't look up from the gear he was treating, heating it with a small torch until the metal glowed dull red in the darkness. 4 hours for these 2. Then we start on the final pair." He pulled the gear from the flame and plunged it into a bucket of oil, the sudden hiss and steam rising like a spirit escaping. "This isn't manufacturing, Captain. This is alchemy. Each gear has to be stressed individually, and if I rush it, the metal becomes brittle. The gear fails. The pilot dies." Pavel moved closer, watching Dmitri work with the focused intensity of an artist creating a masterpiece that no one would ever see. The engineer's hands moved with practiced precision despite his exhaustion, selecting gears, heating them to exact temperatures he judged by color alone, cooling them in precise sequences that transformed crystalline structures at the molecular level. "Tell me about them," Dmitri said quietly, not looking up from his work. "Who?" "The pilots you lost. The ones in the empty chairs." Dmitri finally met Pavel's eyes, and the captain saw something unexpected there. Not curiosity, but need. "I build fighters. Hundreds of them. They leave my factory and fly east, and I never know what happens to them. I never know if my work saved lives or failed to save them. So tell me, make them real." Pavel felt something catch in his throat. He thought about deflecting, about maintaining the professional distance that kept grief manageable. But something in Dmitri's exhausted face demanded honesty. "Anatoly Volkov," Pavel began, his voice rough. 22 years old. From a village so small it didn't have a name, just a number on military maps. He flew like he was dancing, graceful, precise, beautiful to watch. He paused, remembering. "Last month, we encountered a German patrol at 6,500 meters. Anatoly engaged a Bf-109, and he was winning. Better pilot, better tactics. But his Yak couldn't maintain altitude during the fight. The German climbed away, came back from above, and shot him down before Anatoly could react. We found his aircraft 3 days later, buried in snow. He'd survived the crash but died from exposure before rescue arrived. 20 meters from a farmhouse he couldn't see through the blizzard. Dmitri's hands had stopped moving. He stood frozen, the gear forgotten in his grip. "Mikhail Kozlov," Pavel continued, the words coming faster now, a dam breaking. 34, oldest man in the squadron. Had 2 daughters back in Moscow. He wrote them letters every day, even when we had no way to send mail. He kept the letters in his cockpit, hundreds of them, stacked beside his seat. When his engine failed at altitude, he rode the aircraft down rather than bailing out, trying to save it. Trying to bring it home because we needed every fighter. He almost made it. Crashed half a kilometer from the airfield. Stop, Dmitri whispered. Pyotr Rusakov. Igor Timoshenko. Vasily, stop! Dmitri's shout echoed through the factory, and the other mechanics froze in their work. The engineer's face had gone pale, his hands trembling as he carefully set down the gear he'd been holding. I can't hear anymore. Pavel felt ashamed for the cruelty of his honesty, but also strangely cleansed. You asked to make them real. They were already real, Dmitri said, his voice breaking. They were always real. I couldn't let myself think about them. About the weight of what we do here. He gestured around the factory, at the silent fighters waiting to carry men into battle. Every rivet I hammer, every gear I install, every weld I make, they're all equations of life and death. And I build them fast because the quotas demand it, because the war demands it, because if we're too slow then the Germans win. But I never let myself imagine the faces inside the cockpits. One of the mechanics, Sergei, an old man who'd worked in the factory since before the revolution, approached quietly. The imperfections you're creating, Dmitri. Will they save pilots? I don't know, Dmitri admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him something. The theory is sound. The test flight proved the concept. But combat is different. Variables I can't predict, stresses I can't calculate. I'm giving them a tool, but I can't promise it's enough. It's more than they had yesterday, Sergei said simply. He returned to his work, and the others followed, the quiet sounds of modification resuming in the darkness. Pavel watched Dmitri pick up his tools again, watched the engineer's hands steady themselves through force of will. I shouldn't have told you about them. No, Dmitri said. You should have. They deserve to be remembered, and I deserve to know what my failures cost. He selected another gear, examined it under the lamp, and began the heating process again. But Captain, don't tell me any more names, not until this is over. I need to focus on the living, not the dead. They worked through the night in silence, broken only by necessary communication. Pavel stayed, unwilling to leave Dmitri and his crew to bear the burden alone. He learned the names of the other mechanics, Sergei, who'd lost 2 sons in the war, Yuri, barely 18, who'd been rejected from pilot training due to poor eyesight, Alexander, who'd worked on aircraft since the Spanish Civil War, and Boris, who never spoke, but whose hands moved with the confidence of natural talent. As dawn approached, Dmitri completed the 6th and final modification. He held the gear up to the light, examining it with eyes that had learned to see imperfections invisible to others. This one's different, he muttered. The stress pattern isn't quite right. Will it work? Pavel asked. It'll work, but it'll fail sooner than the others. Maybe 50 hours of flight time instead of 100. He set it down with a gentleness that belied his words. I'll mark which aircraft gets this gear. Your pilots need to monitor it closely. How will they know if it's failing? Dmitri smiled without humor. The vibration will become irregular, rough, like the engine is trying to shake itself apart. If that happens, they land immediately, or the gear tears itself to pieces and the propeller stops. He paused. At altitude, that means they glide down or bail out. There's no restarting a dead engine in a Yak-9. Pavel absorbed this information, adding it to the growing list of complications that could kill his pilots, even without German intervention. Anything else I should know? Yes. Dmitri pulled out a worn notebook, its pages covered with sketches and calculations. I've been thinking about the low-speed instability problem. The vibration that helps at altitude makes takeoff and landing dangerous. I can't fix that, not without losing the high-altitude advantage. But I can teach your pilots to compensate. He showed Pavel a series of diagrams illustrating control inputs during critical phases of flight. During takeoff, they need to hold slight forward pressure on the stick until they're above 200 kilometers per hour. Seems counterintuitive, pushing the nose down when you're trying to get airborne, but it prevents the vibration from creating a feedback loop with the control surfaces. During landing, they approach faster than normal, then cut power and drop like a stone in the last 50 meters. No gradual descent, no gentle flare, just a controlled fall that minimizes the time spent in the dangerous speed range. That's going to kill someone, Pavel said flatly. Maybe, Dmitri agreed. But the alternative, staying slow and stable, definitely kills them when German fighters attack from above. Pick your poison, Captain. Pavel studied the diagrams, memorizing the techniques he'd need to teach his squadron. Flying had always been about instinct and feel, but this modification demanded intellectual understanding of mechanical systems. His pilots would need to become engineers as much as warriors. One more thing, Dmitri said, pulling Pavel aside while his mechanics began cleaning up the evidence of their night's work. When this works, not if, when, people will want to know how it happened. There will be investigations, interviews, demands for the technical specifications. Some will want to steal credit. Others will want to assign blame for unauthorized modifications. I'll handle it, Pavel said. No. Dmitri's voice carried unexpected firmness. You'll protect your pilots, because that's what commanders do, but someone has to protect you. So here's what we're going to say. I developed this modification weeks ago and submitted it through proper channels. You were conducting authorized field trials of approved technology. The paperwork got delayed by bureaucratic incompetence, but everything was legitimate. That's a lie. It's a necessary fiction, Dmitri corrected. The truth is that we broke regulations to save lives, but the truth will get us both shot. The fiction? The fiction makes heroes out of innovators and embarrasses bureaucrats who delayed implementation. Everyone wins except the paper pushers, and nobody cares about them. Pavel wanted to argue, wanted to refuse the protection of lies. But he recognized the wisdom in Dmitri's strategy. The war had taught him that survival sometimes required moral flexibility. And if someone investigates? If they find evidence? There is no evidence, Sergei said, emerging from the shadows. We've been very careful about that. The work orders show routine maintenance. The removed components were logged as damaged and scrapped. The new gears came from authorized inventory, properly documented. And if anyone asks, 5 witnesses will testify that Engineer Petrov received verbal approval from Factory Director Sokolov for field trials. There is no Factory Director Sokolov, Pavel said. Exactly, Sergei smiled. Records got destroyed during a German bombing raid last month. Very tragic, very convenient. Pavel looked at these men. An exhausted engineer, an old mechanic, 3 workers whose names would never appear in any history book, and understood that he was witnessing a different kind of courage. Not the dramatic heroism of aerial combat, but the quiet defiance of men who saw a problem and fixed it. Regulations be damned. When they write the history of this war, Pavel said quietly, they'll talk about pilots and generals. They'll never mention you. Good, Dmitri replied. Fame is for the dead. I plan to survive. As the factory's day shift began arriving, Dmitri and his crew vanished into the morning crowd, becoming anonymous workers among hundreds. Pavel watched them go, then turned his attention to the 6 modified fighters sitting innocently on the production line, indistinguishable from their unmodified siblings except for tiny chalk marks on their landing gear. Marks that would be washed away before the aircraft left the factory. In 12 hours, Pavel would lead those fighters into combat. In 12 hours, they would learn if Dmitri's genius was salvation or death sentence. In 12 hours, everything would change. But first, Pavel needed to tell his pilots how to fly these beautiful, deadly, imperfect machines without killing themselves in the process. He walked toward the pilot quarters as the sun rose over Saratov, painting the snow-covered city in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to the small rebellions of desperate men. Airspace above Voronezh sector, February 14, 1943. The sky was a liar. From the ground it looked peaceful. An endless canvas of pale blue stretched over the snow-covered steppes, dotted with clouds that drifted like sheep across a winter pasture. Beautiful. Serene. Empty. But Pavel Sokolov knew better. The sky was never empty. It was a 3-dimensional battlefield where altitude meant power, where every meter of vertical advantage translated into life or death, where the throne belonged to whoever could climb highest, fastest. And for 2 years, that throne had belonged to the Luftwaffe. Red flight, check in. Pavel's voice crackled through the radio, steady despite the fear coiling in his gut like a serpent. Below him, 5 modified Yak-9 fighters held formation, their engines thrumming with the irregular pulse that Dmitri's modifications created. a vibration that Pavel could feel through his seat, his control stick, his bones. Red 2 ready, Lieutenant Kuznetsov's voice, young and eager. Red 3 ready, Sergeant Volkov, calm as always. Red 4 ready, Junior Lieutenant Sokolov, no relation, just a common name that war had made ironic. Red 5 ready. Captain Beregovoy, the oldest pilot in the squadron at 36, his voice carrying the weight of too many friends buried. Red 6 ready. Lieutenant Pavlichenko, who'd lost his brother over Stalingrad and flew every mission like he was chasing the German who'd killed him. 6 modified fighters. 6 pilots betting their lives on an engineer's mad theory. 6 men about to challenge the vertical dominance that had cost the Red Air Force thousands of pilots and aircraft. Blue flight, holding at 4,000 meters. Major Volkov's voice came through the radio, steady and commanding. He was leading the unmodified fighters, 6 standard Yak-9s that would serve as both backup and comparison. If the modifications failed, Blue flight would cover the retreat. If they succeeded, Blue flight would witness history. Pavel checked his instruments. Altitude, 4,200 meters. Airspeed, 420 kilometers per hour. Engine temperature, normal, though the needle vibrated more than usual. Fuel, sufficient for 40 minutes of combat plus reserves. Everything green, everything ready, everything terrifying. Command, this is Red Leader. Beginning high-altitude combat patrol. Pavel pushed his throttle forward and felt his Yak-9 surge upward. The modified gearbox translating engine power into climbing thrust with an efficiency that defied his 2 years of combat experience. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 4,500 meters, 5,000, 5,500, and he was still climbing as fast as he'd been at 3,000 meters. It was working. My God, Kuznetsov breathed over the radio. Red Leader, I'm climbing like I've got rockets attached. Maintain radio discipline, Red 2, Pavel corrected automatically. But he understood the wonder in Kuznetsov's voice. Every Soviet pilot had experienced the soul-crushing frustration of watching German fighters climb away from pursuit, using altitude as an impregnable fortress. Now, for the first time, they had the key to storm that fortress. At 6,000 meters, Pavel leveled off and circled, waiting for his flight to join formation. The air was thin here, cold enough to frost the inside of his canopy, and he could see his breath crystallizing despite his heated flight suit. Below, the world had shrunk to a map. Roads became lines, forests became smudges, the Voronezh River a silver ribbon snaking through the landscape. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, German fighters were hunting. They didn't have to wait long. Contact, bearing 270, altitude 7,000 meters, range 12 kilometers. The warning came from a ground controller. A woman's voice, probably Corporal Svetlana, who had an uncanny ability to spot aircraft on radar before anyone else. 4 contacts, probably Bf-109s, heading east at 450 kilometers per hour. Pavel's heart accelerated, but his hands remained steady. This was the moment. The Germans held altitude advantage, 7,000 meters to Red Flight's 6,000. And tactical doctrine was clear. The high fighter always won. The Germans would dive from their superior position, attack at high speed, then climb back to safety while the Soviet fighters struggled impotently below. Except today, doctrine was about to die. Red Flight, maintain current heading, increase speed to 450 kilometers per hour. Pavel pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Yak-9 accelerate while simultaneously beginning a gradual climb. We're taking the fight to altitude. Red Leader, they're 1,000 meters above us. Volkov's voice carried concern, but not fear. We'll be climbing under fire. Trust the modification, Red 3. Trust Dmitri. Pavel's altimeter read 6,200 meters now, and he was still climbing at a rate that would have been impressive at sea level. They don't know we can do this. That's our advantage. Through his canopy, Pavel spotted them. 4 dark shapes against the pale sky, silhouetted by the afternoon sun. Bf-109G-6S, the latest variant of Germany's premier fighter, each one equipped with a 1,475 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine and armament that could shred a Yak-9 in seconds. Beautiful aircraft. Deadly aircraft, flown by pilots who'd been winning the vertical battle since Operation Barbarossa began. The German formation leader spotted red flight below, and Pavel saw the enemy fighters shift formation, preparing for their diving attack. He could imagine their tactical discussion. 6 Soviet fighters, 800 meters below, climbing toward us, but we'll never reach our altitude before we're in gun range. Standard engagement. Dive, attack, climb away. Easy kills. Except Pavel was now at 6,500 meters, and still climbing at full power. His engine screamed with effort, the modified gearbox creating a vibration that made his instruments blur. But the altimeter kept unwinding. 6,600, 6,700, 6,800. Red leader! Kuznetsov's voice carried disbelief. They're not diving! He was right. The German formation had hesitated, their dive interrupted by the impossible sight of Soviet fighters climbing to meet them at altitude. Pavel could imagine their confusion. How are they climbing so fast? Did intelligence miss a new engine variant? Is this a trap? At 6,900 meters, Pavel armed his weapons. One 20mm Schwack cannon synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, 2 12.7-meter Berezin machine guns mounted in the wings. Not the heaviest armament in the sky, but enough to kill if his bullets found their mark. Red flight, prepare for engagement. Targeting priority. Formation leader, then wingmen. Avoid extended dogfights. We need to prove the climbing advantage. Pavel's voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the terror and exhilaration warring in his chest. On my mark, break by elements and climb through their formation. At 6,950 meters, just 50 meters below the German fighters, Pavel saw the enemy leader make his decision. The Bf-109s rolled into aggressive dives, abandoning their altitude advantage to engage before the Soviet fighters could reach level parity. It was the wrong decision, made from assumptions that were 2 minutes obsolete, and Pavel felt a predatory satisfaction watching them commit to attack. Red flight, break and climb, now! Pavel hauled his control stick back and right, his Yak-9 rolling away from formation while simultaneously climbing at maximum power. The modified gearbox sang with harmonic vibration, and he felt the aircraft pulling upward with acceleration that seemed to defy physics. His altimeter unwound. 7,000 meters. 7,100, 7,200. The German fighters flashed past below him, their diving attack passing harmlessly through empty air, where red flight had been seconds earlier. And now Pavel was above them, holding altitude advantage while 4 Bf-109s were diving away at high speed, losing the vertical position they'd abandoned in pursuit of kills that had evaporated like morning fog. Red flight, maintain altitude and prepare to engage. They'll try to climb back. Pavel circled at 7,200 meters, watching the German fighters pull out of their dives at 6,000 meters and begin the laborious process of regaining lost altitude. Blue flight, this is Red leader. Enemy fighters are diving away from us. Repeat, enemy fighters are diving away. We have altitude advantage. Understood, Red leader. Major Volkov's voice carried undisguised amazement. We're observing from 4,000 meters. Continue engagement. The German fighters were climbing now, their powerful engines pulling them upward, but Pavel could see they were struggling in the thin air. At 6,500 meters, their climb rate had decreased noticeably. At 6,800 meters, they were barely making progress. At 7,000 meters, they were wallowing, their propellers clawing at air too thin to provide efficient thrust. Meanwhile, red flight circled above them like eagles watching rabbits, modified gearboxes providing climbing power that shouldn't exist. Red 2 and Red 3, engage the right element. Red 4 and Red 5, take the left. Red 6, you're with me on the leader. Pavel rolled his Yak-9 inverted and pulled through into a diving attack, his gun sight settling on the leading Bf-109 as it struggled to climb. Remember, short bursts. Don't waste ammunition. These modifications don't help if we run out of bullets. The Messerschmitt saw him coming and tried to turn, but turning bled energy and altitude, luxuries it couldn't afford while trying to climb. Pavel led his target by 2 aircraft lengths, accounting for deflection and bullet drop, and pressed his trigger. The 20mm cannon barked 3 times, recoil shuddering through the airframe, and Pavel saw his shells impact the Bf-109's left wing root. Metal shredded, pieces flying away in the slipstream, and suddenly the German fighters' clean lines were marred by jagged holes and trailing smoke. The Messerschmitt rolled away, diving for safety, and Pavel let it go. His mission wasn't to score kills, though that would be satisfying, but to prove the modification worked. One damaged German fighter running for home was proof enough. Around him, Red Flight was demonstrating 2 years of accumulated frustration. Kuznetsov and Volkov had cornered another Bf-109, taking turns attacking while it tried desperately to climb away. Their bullets stitched patterns across its fuselage, and Pavel saw its canopy shatter, the pilot slumping in his seat before the aircraft began its final dive. The remaining 2 German fighters had broken formation entirely, abandoning their wingmen to dive away at maximum speed, trading altitude for survival. It was the right tactical decision. Stay and die, or run and live. But Pavel knew the psychological impact would be devastating. German pilots relied on their altitude advantage like infantry relied on trenches. Today, that advantage had been stolen. Red Flight, break off pursuit. Reform at 7,000 meters. Pavel checked his fuel, still adequate, but no need to push their luck. Blue Flight, did you observe the engagement? Affirmative, Red Leader. Major Volkov's voice carried emotions Pavel couldn't quite identify. We observed Soviet fighters engage from superior altitude against Bf-109Gs. We observed enemy fighters unable to match our climb rate. We observed... History, Captain Sokolov. Pavel circled at 7,000 meters, his squadron rejoining formation, and looked down at the world spread below him. Somewhere in that vast landscape, a damaged German fighter was limping home. Somewhere, another German pilot was dead, his Messerschmitt burning in a snow-covered field. And somewhere, German squadron commanders were receiving radio reports that would shake their understanding of the Eastern Front's aerial balance. Red Flight, return to base, mission accomplished. Pavel rolled his Yak-9 onto a westward heading, beginning the long descent home. His aircraft vibrated with the modified gearbox's harmonic pulse. Irregular, imperfect, beautiful. They'd climbed to the vertical throne, and they'd won. As they descended through 5,000 meters, Pavel's radio crackled with Major Volkov's voice. Private channel, commander to commander. Whatever you and that engineer did, Captain, it worked. But this is going to have consequences. The Luftwaffe won't tolerate losing altitude advantage. They'll adapt, escalate, bring in new tactics. Let them, Pavel replied, watching the snow-covered steppes rise up to meet him. For 2 years, we've fought from disadvantage. For 2 years, we've lost pilots because German fighters could climb away whenever they wanted. Today, that ended. Whatever comes next, at least it'll be a fair fight. His landing was rough. The modified gearbox made the final approach unstable, just as Dmitri had warned. But Pavel didn't care. His wheels touched down hard, his Yak-9 bouncing once before settling, and he taxied toward the flight line where ground crews were already rushing to meet them. As Pavel climbed down from his cockpit, legs trembling with adrenaline come down, he saw Dmitri standing beside the hangar, watching with an expression that mixed relief, vindication, and something deeper. Maybe the knowledge that his broken gears had saved lives today, that his midnight work had meaning beyond quotas and production schedules. Their eyes met across the tarmac, and no words were necessary. An engineer and a pilot, connected by the imperfect machines that made impossible things possible. The war wasn't over. The fighting would continue, the dying would continue, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But today, 6 Soviet fighters had climbed higher than they should have been able to climb, had fought from advantage instead of disadvantage, and had proven that imperfection, calibrated, controlled, understood, could defeat perfection. Today, they'd made the sky a little less empty, a little less lonely, and a little less German. Character count, 11,847. Chapter 4, The Price of Innovation. Moscow, Aviation Design Bureau Headquarters, March 1943. The telegram had arrived at dawn, terse and official. Captain Sokolov and Engineer Petrov required immediately Moscow's stop. Air Marshal Novikov demands personal briefing. Stop, non-negotiable stop. Now Pavel stood in a corridor that smelled of floor polish and bureaucratic power, his dress uniform feeling stiff and foreign after weeks in flight gear. Beside him, Dmitri fidgeted with a leather portfolio containing technical drawings, His civilian suit rumpled from the overnight train journey from Saratov. Neither man had slept. "They're going to arrest us," Dmitri whispered, his face pale. "Court-martial for unauthorized modifications." "We should have stayed at the factory, disappeared into—" "Engineer Petrov, Captain Sokolov." The voice came from an office doorway, sharp, feminine, commanding. A woman in a major's uniform gestured them inside. "The air marshal is waiting." The office was surprisingly modest. A desk, filing cabinets, maps covering the walls showing the vast Eastern Front. And behind the desk sat Air Marshal Alexander Novikov, commander of the Soviet Air Forces, his face hard and weathered like granite shaped by wind. He was studying a report, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said without looking up. They sat. The silence stretched like a wire being pulled taut, threatening to snap. Pavel could hear Dmitri's breathing, quick and shallow, could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs. Through the window, Moscow sprawled under gray winter sky, a city that had survived Napoleon and Hitler's armies both, built on sacrifice and stubbornness. Finally, Novikov set down the report and looked at them with eyes that had witnessed Stalingrad, had watched the Red Air Force rebuilt from near destruction, had buried more pilots than Pavel had ever met. 17 confirmed engagements, Novikov said, tapping the report. Modified Yak-9 fighters versus Bf-109Gs at altitude. 17 times, Soviet fighters achieved altitude superiority. 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, 9 damaged, 3 probables. 0 modified aircraft lost to enemy action. He paused. 2 lost to mechanical failure during landing. Pilot error, according to the investigation. Is that accurate, Captain? Pavel's mouth was dry. The modifications create low-speed instability, sir. My pilots were still learning to compensate. Both crashes were my responsibility. Inadequate training protocols. I didn't ask whose responsibility it was. I asked if the report was accurate. Yes, sir. Accurate. Novikov shifted his gaze to Dmitri, who seemed to shrink under that scrutiny. And you? An engineer at factory number 292. No formal aeronautical degree. No authorization to modify military aircraft designs. No approval from the Aviation Design Bureau. His voice hardened. Do you understand that what you did, changing aircraft specifications without authorization, is a criminal offense? Dmitri's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Yes, sir. Do you understand that unauthorized modifications that result in aircraft losses can be classified as sabotage? That sabotage during wartime carries the death penalty? Yes, sir. Good. Novikov stood, walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Then you understand the severity of your actions. You bypassed regulations designed to ensure aircraft safety. You endangered pilots' lives. You acted with complete disregard for proper procedures. He turned, and Pavel was shocked to see something like a smile ghosting across the air marshal's granite features. And you gave us the first significant tactical advantage over Luftwaffe fighters since the war began. The relief that flooded through Pavel was almost painful. Beside him, Dmitri made a sound like a deflating balloon. The Luftwaffe has dominated high-altitude combat for 2 years, Novikov continued, returning to his desk. Their fighters climb faster, their fuel injection systems don't fail in negative G maneuvers, and their pilots are trained to exploit vertical advantage. We've lost thousands of aircraft and pilots because we couldn't compete in that arena. He tapped the report again. Until an exhausted engineer made a mistake and a desperate pilot decided to gamble on it. He opened a folder, pulled out photographs, aerial reconnaissance images showing German airfields. These were taken 3 days ago. Notice anything unusual? Pavel studied the images. At first, he saw nothing remarkable. Dispersed aircraft, maintenance facilities, fuel dumps. Then he noticed. Several Bf-109s were fitted with what looked like modified propellers and larger supercharger intakes. They're adapting, Novikov said. German engineering responding to Soviet innovation. They're rushing modifications to improve high-altitude performance because, for the first time, they're afraid of losing the vertical advantage they've relied upon. He smiled without humor. Fear is a weapon, gentlemen. You've put fear into the Luftwaffe. Sir, Pavel ventured, what happens now? To Engineer Petrov, and to the modification program? Novikov sat down, steepled his fingers, and studied them both. That depends. The Aviation Design Bureau wants Engineer Petrov arrested for unauthorized modifications. The factory director wants him fired for falsifying work orders. The NKVD wants to investigate whether his actions constitute sabotage. He paused. And I want him promoted to chief engineer of fighter modifications, and given authority to implement his broken gear system across all Yak-9 production. Dmitri's eyes widened. Sir, I don't have the credentials for— You have something better than credentials, Novikov interrupted. You have results. 17 engagements. 0 losses to enemy action. That's your resume, engineer. The paperwork we can fabricate. He turned to Pavel. And you, Captain. Your squadron has the highest kill ratio on the Voronezh front. Your pilots are alive when they should be dead. I'm promoting you to Major and assigning you to train other squadrons in high-altitude combat tactics using modified aircraft. What about the unauthorized modifications? Pavel asked. The regulations we violated? What unauthorized modifications? Novikov's face was expressionless. According to the documents I'm about to create, Engineer Petrov submitted his modification proposal through proper channels 3 months ago. The Aviation Design Bureau approved field trials. You conducted those trials with full authorization. There was some unfortunate delay in paperwork processing. Bureaucratic inefficiency, very regrettable. But everything was entirely legal. That's a lie, sir, Dmitri said quietly. That's a necessary fiction, Novikov corrected. The truth is complicated and would result in courts-martial that wastes time we don't have. The fiction is simple and allows us to save lives immediately. Which version serves the motherland better, engineer? Dmitri looked at Pavel, who gave a small nod. Sometimes survival required moral flexibility. Sometimes the greater good demanded smaller lies. The fiction serves the motherland, sir, Dmitri said. Excellent. Novikov pulled out 2 folders, handed one to each of them. These are your new assignments. Engineer Petrov, you'll establish a modification facility here in Moscow. I'm giving you authorization to recruit mechanics, appropriate resources, and implement the gear modification across all new Yak-9 production within 60 days. Major Sokolov, you'll select pilots from your squadron to serve as instructors. Within 3 months, I want every fighter regiment on the Eastern Front capable of high-altitude superiority combat. He stood, and they stood with him. Gentlemen, what you did was reckless, unauthorized, and technically illegal. It was also brilliant, necessary, and exactly the kind of innovation that wins wars. The Germans have superior engineering, but they worship perfection. We have inferior resources, but we're willing to embrace imperfection when it works. He extended his hand first to Dmitri, then to Pavel. Thank you for giving our pilots a fighting chance. As they left the office, walking through corridors that no longer felt threatening, Dmitri turned to Pavel with a dazed expression. We're not being arrested. Apparently not. I'm being promoted. Apparently so. This is insane. Dmitri laughed, slightly hysterical. A month ago, I was afraid of being sent to a labor camp. Now I'm chief engineer of fighter modifications. How does that happen? Pavel thought about the question as they emerged into Moscow's cold afternoon, the city bustling around them, civilians going about their lives, soldiers on leave, the machinery of war and survival grinding forward. I think it happens because we're losing, and desperate times make people willing to try desperate solutions. And sometimes, those solutions work. They walked in silence for a while. 2 men who'd gambled everything on a theory, and somehow won. As they approached the train station for their return journey, Dmitri to Moscow's modification facility, Pavel back to his squadron, Dmitri stopped. The pilots you lost, he said quietly. Anatoly, Mikhail, the others. This modification won't bring them back. No, Pavel agreed. But it might keep others alive. That's all we can do. Save the ones who come after. Is that enough? Pavel thought about empty chairs in the mess hall, about letters that would never be answered, about young men who'd burned or frozen or bled out in cockpits far from home. It has to be, because the alternative is giving up, and we can't afford that. Dmitri nodded slowly, then pulled something from his pocket, a small metal gear tooth, the original imperfection that had started everything. I was going to give this to the air marshal. Historical artifact, proof of concept, all that. He pressed it into Pavel's hand. But I think you should have it, to remember that sometimes the things that look broken are exactly what we need. Pavel closed his fingers around the gear tooth, feeling its irregular surface, the stress fracture that had changed everything. What are you going to remember this by? I'll remember it every time a pilot comes home alive who shouldn't have, Dmitri said simply. That's monument enough. They shook hands, an engineer and a pilot, their lives intersecting for a brief moment in history's vast sweep, and parted ways. Dmitri disappeared into Moscow's crowds, already thinking about production schedules and quality control. Pavel boarded the eastbound train, already planning training protocols and combat doctrine. The war continued. It would continue for 2 more years. Brutal, grinding, costly beyond measure. But the sky had changed. The vertical throne that had belonged exclusively to the Luftwaffe now had competition. Soviet fighters could climb, could fight at altitude, could challenge enemy aircraft on terms approaching equality. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was hope, forged from broken gears and desperate gambles, built by men who refused to accept that perfection was the only path to success. Epilogue. Voronezh Airfield, April 1945. Major Pavel Sokolov, now Lieutenant Colonel, decorated veteran of 4 years of aerial combat, stood beside a Yak-3 fighter, watching young pilots taxi for takeoff. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. Berlin was surrounded, Hitler's Reich collapsing into rubble and surrender. An old mechanic approached, someone Pavel didn't recognize at first. Then he saw the eyes, still intense, still seeing the world in equations and stress tolerances, and realized it was Dmitri, aged beyond his years by wartime labor. Chief Engineer Petrov, Pavel greeted him formally, then smiled. Or should I say, hero of the Soviet Union? That medal is propaganda, Dmitri said, though Pavel knew he wore it. I built better gears. That's not heroism. You saved thousands of lives. That's the definition of heroism. They watched the fighters take off. Young pilots who'd never known a time when Soviet aircraft couldn't compete at altitude, who'd been trained from the start to use the vertical battlefield as their domain. Do they know? Pavel asked. Do they know that their ability to climb came from an exhausted engineer's mistake? Some do. Most don't care about the history. They just fly the aircraft they're given. Dmitri pulled out a cigarette, lit it with the same battered lighter he'd used in the factory 3 years ago. But I know, every time a pilot lands safe, I know that somewhere in their aircraft is a deliberately imperfect gear, a controlled flaw, a mistake that became a weapon. The Germans never figured it out, Pavel said. They kept trying to build more powerful engines, better superchargers, perfect systems. They never understood that we won by embracing imperfection. They couldn't understand it, Dmitri corrected. Their entire philosophy was built on engineering perfection, on precision and order. Asking them to deliberately break something to make it better? That was psychologically impossible. We won because we were willing to be imperfect. A telegram courier approached, handed Pavel a message. He read it, then showed it to Dmitri. Berlin has fallen, stop Reich surrendering, stop victory in Europe, imminent, stop. They stood together in silence, watching fighters climb into the spring sky, climbing higher and faster than anyone had thought possible when the war began, when Moscow was burning, when survival seemed impossible and victory a fever dream. Was it worth it? Dmitri asked quietly. All the deaths, all the suffering, all the years. Pavel thought about the question, about faces he'd never forget, about pilots who'd died before the modifications could save them, about the astronomical cost of victory measured in millions of lives. Ask me when I'm old, he finally said. When the nightmares stop, when I can sleep without hearing engines screaming. Maybe then I'll know. And if they never stop? Pavel watched a young pilot execute a perfect climbing turn at altitude, A maneuver that would have been impossible in 1941, routine in 1945, built on the foundation of an engineer's desperate innovation and a pilot's reckless gamble. Then we'll remember them anyway, Pavel said. The ones who fell so others could climb. That's what we owe them, memory and meaning. Dmitri crushed his cigarette under his boot, the gesture so familiar it hurt. I'm going back to Saratov after the war, back to the factory. They want me to design peacetime aircraft, passenger planes, cargo transports, things that don't kill people. Will you? Probably, but I'll never forget what we built here, what we broke and made better. He extended his hand. It's been an honor, Pavel Sokolov. Building broken things with you. Pavel gripped his hand, rough and scarred, shaped by work that history would barely remember. The honor was mine, Dmitri Petrov. Flying your impossible machines. They parted then, two men whose lives had intersected at a critical moment, who'd changed the course of aerial warfare through desperation and innovation, whose names would appear in a few technical reports and a footnote or two in aviation history. But in the sky above them, fighters climbed, imperfect, vibrating, alive, carrying pilots who would come home to families, to futures, to lives made possible by a broken gear and the men brave enough to believe in it. The war was ending, the climbing never would.